The ballroom smelled like money. That specific kind, not the sharp mineral scent of coins or the worn paper smell of old bills, but the ambient, layered fragrance of money that has been circulating long enough to pick up other things. Imported flowers, dry-cleaned wool, cognac at $400 a pour. The collective confidence of 200 people who had never once questioned whether they deserved to be in a room this expensive. I stood at the back, near the service corridor entrance, holding a glass of water I hadn't touched. On the stage, a 50-foot LED wall displayed a promotional video that had clearly cost more to produce than my village's entire annual municipal budget. Aerial footage of forest canopy, a mountain stream catching afternoon light, children running through fields that did not belong to any community I recognized. The color grade was immaculate, every green slightly oversaturated, every water surface rendered in a blue that existed nowhere in nature, the visual language of aspiration rather than reality. Then Sterling Vance appeared on screen, white-haired patrician, the practiced warmth of a man who had given this particular speech in front of enough cameras to have refined it to something approaching art. Vance Chemical Holdings, the voiceover said, in the measured baritone that had been selected by a communications firm, has always believed that industrial progress and environmental stewardship are not opposing forces. I stopped listening. I had heard the words before. Different arrangement, same architecture. I had been listening to variations of them for 14 months, and I understood by now that they were not meant to convey information. They were meant to occupy the space where information would otherwise go. I looked down at my laptop, open on the small table beside me, its screen angled away from the nearest camera. The terminal window showed a clean readout. Network handshake confirmed, media controller access authenticated, execution script loaded and standing by. 3 weeks of patient, methodical work sitting in a single line of code, waiting for the precise moment. On stage, Sterling walked to the podium to sustained applause. Politicians in the front row, fund managers, 3 television cameras and a full press row. The kind of room that constituted, in Sterling's operational logic, reality itself. The room where things became true because the right people witnessed them becoming true. Vance Chemical stands for a sustainable future, he said. I typed 2 words into the terminal. /Project the Poison, SH. The LED wall behind him shattered into static. Not a crash, not a failure, but a clean handoff. The way a signal changes when something stronger takes over the frequency. For half a second the ballroom held its collective breath. Then the split screen appeared. Left side, a live telemetry cascade, chemical readings in scrolling red columns. The numbers beside each compound name climbing past regulatory limits and continuing upward. Cadmium at 380% above the federal threshold. Arsenic at 420. Lead compounds registering in concentrations that had no legitimate industrial explanation. Time-stamped, cryptographically signed, the kind of data that courts called immutable. Right side, infrared drone footage, the thermal signature of a riverbank in darkness, and the unmistakable visual of submerged discharge valves cycling open, thick effluent blooming outward in the thermal image like something alive, spreading into the current. The timestamp in the upper corner reading 6 hours and 14 minutes ago. The applause had stopped before the second camera had finished its pan. Sterling turned to look at the screen behind him. His microphone was still live. The entire room heard the sharp, involuntary intake of breath, not a gasp, something smaller and more fundamental than that, the sound a person makes when their understanding of a situation revises itself faster than their composure can follow. His phone was in his hand. I watched him look at it. The stock ticker was already moving. In the service corridor behind me, someone said something into a radio. I closed my laptop, picked up my water glass, and set it carefully on the table. The room was very loud now, in the way rooms get loud when no one knows what to say but everyone is trying. He thought he could buy the silence of a dying village with a few cheap scholarships. He didn't realize the river itself had been logging his crimes. But the ballroom and the split screen in Sterling's face in that moment, that's the end of the story. To understand the beginning, you have to go back to a different kind of water. Back to the white foam on my family's fishing dock. Back to the morning my father showed me the fish. I grew up in Crestfield, not the Crestfield that appeared on regional tourism maps. The one with the covered bridge photograph and the heritage trail markers and the small blurb about the annual Harvest Festival. That version of Crestfield was real, technically, in the way that a photograph of a person is real. Accurate at a specific moment, selective about what it includes, unable to convey what has happened since. The Crestfield I returned to 14 months ago was a different place. I had been working for 7 years as an environmental data scientist for a federal monitoring agency, which meant I had spent 7 years quantifying the ways industrial operations degraded ecosystems, measuring, modeling, documenting, submitting reports that moved through administrative channels at the pace of bureaucratic geology. I was good at the work. I understood the data. I understood what the numbers meant in terms of soil contamination half-life, bioaccumulation rates, the specific timeline of damage as heavy metals moved through a watershed. What I had not fully understood until I came home was what the numbers looked like from the other side. My father called me in October of the previous year. He didn't usually call, we communicated mostly by text, brief and practical. The communication pattern of two people who understood each other well enough that elaboration felt unnecessary. When he called, I knew before I answered that something had shifted. The Harmon boy died, he said. Chester Harmon's youngest. They're saying it was the kidneys. Chester Harmon's youngest was 19 years old. I drove up the following weekend and I walked the river with my father for 3 hours. And I stopped saying very much about 20 minutes in because there wasn't language adequate to what I was seeing that didn't feel clinical, and clinical felt wrong. The Aldermast River ran for 42 miles through our county, and the stretch that bordered Crestfield had been the economic and ecological center of the community for 4 generations. My grandfather had fished it commercially. My father had taken me to it as a child with the specific reverence people reserve for things they consider foundational. The river had not been pristine when I was young. No river adjacent to an agricultural valley was, but it had been alive. What I walked beside in October was not alive. The water carried a persistent surface foam that collected against the banks in thick, yellowed mats. The color of the water itself had shifted, not dramatically, not the obvious rust orange of iron contamination or the bright green of algal bloom, but a dullness, a quality of opacity that water shouldn't have in the autumn when the sediment load was low. The smell was faint but present, something chemical underneath the cold air, a background note that didn't belong. The bank vegetation was thinning in a pattern I recognized from professional assessments. The fish population, my father told me, had declined by what he estimated as 80% over 18 months. The herons that had nested along the eastern bend for as long as anyone could remember had not returned the previous spring. Vance Chemical Holdings had completed the expansion of their regional processing facility 22 months ago. The facility sat 4 miles upstream, on a parcel that had been rezoned for heavy industrial use through a permitting process that had moved with unusual speed through county channels. I did not need to run tests to form a hypothesis. I had spent 7 years learning to read watersheds, and this one was telling me something unambiguous. I ran the tests anyway. I spent the first 2 weeks back quietly. I collected water samples at 11 points along the river corridor, sediment cores at 6 locations, tissue samples from the fish population I could find. I sent them to 3 separate independent laboratories under a consulting entity I maintained for private work. I drove the roads near the facility in the early mornings, noting discharge points, observing drainage infrastructure, building a spatial model of the likely contamination pathway. The results came back over the following 3 weeks, and they confirmed what the river had already told me. Cadmium, arsenic, chromium VI, lead compounds. Concentrations that in some locations exceeded federal thresholds by margins that should have triggered automatic regulatory response. The sediment cores showed an 18-month contamination timeline that aligned precisely with the completion of the facility expansion. I compiled the data into a formal report and filed it with the state environmental agency. The acknowledgement came back in 11 days. The complaint had been received and assigned to a review queue with an estimated processing time of 14 to 18 months. I filed a parallel submission with the Federal Environmental Enforcement Office. That acknowledgement arrived in 3 weeks. The matter had been referred to regional oversight for preliminary assessment, which would require coordination with state-level findings before federal jurisdiction could be established. I hired an environmental attorney, a good one, who reviewed my data and told me, with the specific careful honesty of a professional who had navigated these systems for 20 years, that the case was strong on the science and would be extraordinarily difficult in practice. Corporate legal teams for operations at Vance's scale operated on attrition economics. They could sustain litigation for longer than most plaintiffs could finance it, and the regulatory pathways were structured in ways that, intentionally or not, favored delay. How long, I asked. She looked at her notes. To get to meaningful enforcement action, conservatively 6 to 10 years, if they're active in their defense longer. I drove back to Crestfield that evening and sat with my father on the back porch until the light went, and I thought about Chester Harmon's youngest, and I thought about the heron nests that weren't coming back, and I thought about 6 to 10 years as a unit of time measured against a river that was already showing acute stress indicators. I did not say what I was thinking, neither did he. That was the week Sterling Vance announced the EcoShield initiative. The press conference was held in the county seat, which was a 40-minute drive from Crestfield, and I watched it on a live stream at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while I was watching. Sterling had the presentation quality that comes from having spent decades in rooms where presentation quality was the primary currency. He was 70, fit in the manner of expensive preventive medicine, and he carried the ease of a man who had never inhabited a professional context where he was not the most powerful person present. He spoke about Vance Chemical's long history in the region, 400 jobs, he said, which was true and was doing the work of many other facts he was not saying. He spoke about the company's environmental commitment, their investment in compliance infrastructure, their third-party auditing partnerships. The names of the auditing firms delivered with the confident specificity of someone who understood that named specificity read as transparency regardless of what the names actually meant. Then he announced the Crestfield Youth Environmental Scholarship Fund. $250,000, he said, annual in perpetuity. The cameras caught him smiling with the particular warmth of someone giving something away. What he did not mention during the press conference, what the press did not mention because the press had not been told, was that in the 2 weeks preceding the announcement, Vance Chemical's legal team had been conducting a systematic house-to-house campaign through Crestfield and the 3 adjacent communities, presenting residents with a document described as a community partnership agreement. The document, which ran to 14 pages in a point size that required a magnifying glass to read comfortably, included in its 7th section a clause releasing Vance Chemical Holdings and all affiliated entities from any present or future civil liability related to environmental or health impacts within a defined geographic radius. In exchange for signing, residents received a one-time payment of $3,000. Most people signed. They were frightened. Many of them were already sick or had sick family members. They needed the money. And the legal language was dense enough that understanding precisely what they were surrendering required either legal training or the kind of deliberate patience that is difficult to sustain when you are worried about your kidneys or your children or your livestock. My father did not sign. I found out because a representative from Vance's community relations firm came to the house on a Tuesday morning while I was there. A young man in a company polo shirt who had clearly been briefed on how to present the agreement in accessible terms, and who did not appear to have been briefed on how to handle a former federal environmental scientist sitting at the kitchen table when he arrived. He went through his presentation. My father listened without interruption. When the young man finished, my father looked at the document for a moment. "I know what's in there," my father said. His voice was level, not angry, something quieter than anger. "And I'm not signing it." The young man said there might be additional considerations available for households with documented health impacts. My father looked at him. "You can leave now," he said. The representative left. He called back twice over the following week, and then a different person called, not a community relations representative, but someone from Vance's legal department with a different register, not warm, just precise, outlining the limits of what legal action could realistically achieve, the length of time involved, the costs, the precedent in comparable cases. I listened to the second call on speaker from the kitchen doorway. When it ended, my father set the phone down on the table and sat with his hands folded for a moment. I had been running calculations for 2 weeks that I hadn't told him about, thinking about the regulatory timelines my attorney had given me, thinking about the scholarship fund and the liability waivers operating simultaneously, the public face and the legal infrastructure running in parallel, one designed to generate goodwill and coverage, the other designed to foreclose the consequences of what was generating the need for goodwill. I understood the system Sterling had built. I had watched versions of it operate for 7 years from the regulatory side, and I knew its tolerances and its pressure points and the specific places where its architecture assumed it would not be challenged by someone with a particular combination of skill. I walked back to my workbench in the spare bedroom. I opened my materials inventory spreadsheet. I started a new project file and named it ALDERMAST. The river needed a voice that the regulatory system couldn't delay and corporate lawyers couldn't redact. I was going to build it one sensor at a time. The first sensor took 11 days to get right. Not the concept came quickly, assembled from 7 years of field instrumentation work and the specific problem I was trying to solve. The challenge was the form factor. A standard environmental monitoring probe was a recognizable object. Cylindrical, branded, attached to a cable, the kind of equipment that triggered immediate identification if anyone with facility security training happened to see it. What I needed was something that would survive prolonged submersion in chemically aggressive water, perform continuous mass spectrometry analysis of dissolved compounds, transmit encrypted telemetry data over a mesh network, and look to any casual observer or underwater camera sweep, like a piece of river debris. I worked from my spare bedroom, which I had converted over the first week into something between a laboratory and an electronics workshop. My father asked me once what I was building. I told him monitoring equipment. He nodded and brought me a sandwich and didn't ask again. The housing I fabricated from a high-density polymer composite, a material I sourced through a university lab supply contact. Chemically inert across the pH and temperature range I expected the discharge environment to present. I molded it in 2 halves, irregular in profile, with a surface texture I achieved by pressing the uncured material against actual river gravel and bark fragments. When finished and darkened with a thin iron oxide wash, the devices looked convincingly like waterlogged wood segments, the kind of debris that accumulated in any industrial waterway without attracting attention. Inside each housing, a microspectrometer array capable of detecting dissolved heavy metal compounds at parts per billion sensitivity, a temperature and flow rate sensor, a GPS module for positional logging, a mesh networking chip that could relay data through a distributed node network without requiring direct line of sight to a receiver, and a power cell rated for 90 days of continuous operation. The cryptographic signing module was the component I spent the most time on. I needed the data the sensors produced to be legally immutable, not just accurate, but structured in a format that a federal court would accept as tamper-evident evidence. Each telemetry packet needed to be time-stamped, location tagged, and cryptographically signed at the point of generation, before transmission, so that the chain of custody from sensor to terminal could be independently verified. I had consulted, carefully and hypothetically, with a data forensics attorney I knew from a previous professional engagement, and I understood the specific technical requirements that separated environmental monitoring data that could be dismissed as potentially manipulated from data that could not. I built to the higher standard. By the end of the second week, I had 6 functional units. I tested them in a water tank in the garage, running controlled solutions of known chemical composition through a simulated flow environment, verifying detection sensitivity and transmission reliability across varying turbidity levels. All 6 performed within acceptable parameters. I made 3 small modifications to the spectrometer calibration protocol, reran the tests, and was satisfied. Then I drove to the river at 4 in the morning and tested them in actual conditions. I waded into the aldermast at a point 2 miles downstream from the facility, in a section of bank obscured from the nearest road by a stand of mature cottonwoods, and I let the current take 3 of the units while I tracked their telemetry from my laptop in the car. The mesh network established itself within 90 seconds of deployment. The data stream was clean. The chemical readings from that section of the river, which I already knew from my earlier sampling, matched the sensor output to within the margin of error I had set as acceptable. I pulled the units back in, dried them, and drove home. The deployment site was the problem I had been building towards solving. Surface deployment in the river would produce data, but it would produce data about what was in the water after the contamination had mixed and diluted across the full flow volume. What I needed was data from inside the discharge infrastructure itself, readings taken at the point of emission before dilution, where the chemical concentrations would be at their highest, and the causal link to the facility would be unambiguous. I had studied the facility's discharge infrastructure from public environmental permit filings, which contained schematic diagrams of approved wastewater management systems. What those filings described, and what I had observed from the riverbank during my morning reconnaissance drives, did not fully correspond. The permitted outflow volumes and the contamination levels I had documented in my sampling data could not be reconciled unless there was discharge infrastructure operating outside the permitted system. I had identified two probable locations for unpermitted discharge points based on the contamination gradient patterns in my sediment core data. Both were in the river section that ran along the facility's southern perimeter, a stretch of bank that was within the facility's security perimeter, lit at night by perimeter lighting, and monitored by cameras positioned at the fence line. I spent 4 nights observing the camera rotation patterns from the opposite bank. The cameras swept on a consistent interval. The perimeter lighting had a gap, a section of bank approximately 30 meters wide where the illumination from 2 adjacent fixtures overlapped imperfectly, creating a region of relative shadow. The shadow window lasted approximately 8 minutes per rotation cycle. 8 minutes was workable. I prepared for the entry on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after I had begun. I drove to the access point after midnight, parked off the county road in a farm equipment pull-off that gave me legal standing if anyone asked, and walked the half-mile to the river in the dark without a flashlight, moving on terrain I had covered enough times in daylight to know by feel. The water was cold. That is what I remember most clearly. Not the chemicals, though I was aware of them, had calculated my exposure risk and accepted it, had treated my skin with a barrier preparation and was wearing a thin wetsuit under my outer layer. Not the lights from the facility, which were present but manageable. The cold, specifically, and the way the riverbed shifted underfoot in the dark, clay-heavy and unstable, the current stronger than it looked from the bank. I moved slowly along the southern perimeter, keeping to the shadow line, locating the first probable discharge point by the flow disturbance I could feel against my legs before I could see anything. I anchored the first sensor unit to the discharge manifold using a ceramic-coated mounting bracket I had fabricated for the purpose, positioned so that the intake aperture sat directly in the outflow path. I verified the mesh connection on my wrist unit. Confirmed. The second location was 40 meters further along, closer to the facility's active perimeter. I had 6 minutes remaining in the camera rotation window. I moved carefully, staying low, keeping my movement slow and deliberate, not because I was frightened exactly, but because the situation had a specific quality of consequence that demanded that kind of attention. One wrong movement, one camera frame at the wrong moment, and the entire architecture I had spent 3 weeks building would collapse. And more importantly, the data I needed would never reach the people who needed to act on it. I found the second manifold by feel, anchored the sensor, confirmed the connection. I was back on the opposite bank in 11 minutes, well inside the rotation window, sitting in wet grass, watching the facility lights reflect in the water while my heart rate came back down to something reasonable. I drove home, dried off, and opened my laptop. The telemetry feed was live. Both sensors were transmitting. The chemical readings from inside the discharge manifolds were. I sat with the numbers for a long time before I wrote anything in my notes, not because I was surprised, but because there is a particular quality to confirmation when what you're confirming is this order of magnitude of harm. Cadmium at 360% above the federal discharge limit. Arsenic compounds at 405. Lead, chromium VI. Not trace contamination, not the kind of numbers that invited debate about methodology. Numbers that told a story with no alternative interpretation. I watched the feed for 2 hours. The discharge was not continuous. It cycled, a pattern of inactive periods followed by high-volume release windows. The release windows, I noted in my log, corresponded to the late night and early morning hours. The hours when no regulatory inspector would be present, when aerial monitoring was least likely, when the river was just a dark shape moving through a dark landscape, with no one to witness what was being put into it. I set the sensor network to continuous logging and closed the laptop. The Vance Chemical Eco Shield Gala was announced 3 weeks after I completed the sensor deployment. Formal invitation only. The Intercontinental Hotel in the city. An evening described in the press release as a celebration of Vance Chemical's environmental leadership and the formal launch of their Global Eco Shield initiative, which would, the release stated, involve a $50 million commitment to sustainable industrial practices across their North American operations. The guest list, inferred from the press release language and the organizations named as partners, included federal trade representatives, institutional investors, environmental certification bodies, and a media contingent that would ensure any announcement made at the event received broad financial press coverage. Sterling Vance would deliver the keynote address. I read the press release twice, then pulled up the event venue's public-facing infrastructure documentation, the kind of technical information that hospitality venues made available to event production companies, containing network topology overviews for AV and display systems, bandwidth specifications, media server configuration. I spent the rest of that evening reading it carefully, and then I found something. The Intercontinental's event media infrastructure had been upgraded 18 months ago through a contract with a regional AV integration firm. That firm's client portfolio, listed on their public website, included Vance Logistics Partners, a freight and distribution subsidiary of Vance Chemical Holdings. The integration firm had used a standardized network architecture across multiple client installations, which was common practice and efficient, and in this specific case, meant that certain network configuration protocols were shared across their installation portfolio. I am not going to describe, precisely and completely, every technical step that followed over the next 10 days. What I will say is that network infrastructure built on standardized architecture by the same integration firm, for clients operating in the same regional network ecosystem, contained predictable structural characteristics, and that a person with sufficient familiarity with those characteristics, and with the specific tools I had been developing and refining for federal environmental monitoring work over 7 years, could, given enough time and patience, identify a pathway through that architecture to the media controller that managed the display systems in the Intercontinental's main ballroom. Not a forced entry, not a destructive intrusion. A pathway, a route that existed because of how the system had been built, used in the way the system had been built to allow, simply redirected toward a different destination than its designers had intended. I mapped the route over 8 days, working carefully, testing each step in isolation, building the execution script incrementally so that each component could be verified before being integrated. The script itself was not complex once the pathway was established. A connection sequence, an authentication handshake using credentials derived from the shared architecture, a media override command that would redirect the ballroom's primary display output to an external stream source and the stream source itself, a live feed pulling simultaneously from my sensor telemetry, reformatted for visual display, chemical readings rendered as the scrolling red data cascade I had designed for maximum legibility at large format scale, and from the thermal drone footage I had been collecting of the facility's nighttime operations for the previous 3 weeks. I had a licensed commercial drone. I had thermal imaging capability. I had been flying over the public river corridor adjacent to the facility in the early hours of the morning, documenting the discharge cycle with the same methodical regularity I brought to everything else. The footage was extensive, clear, legally obtained from public airspace, and deeply incriminating. On the night I completed the execution script, I ran a full dry run test against a sandboxed replica of the pathway I had mapped, confirming that every component performed as designed. The terminal showed clean execution in 4 seconds. I leaned back from the desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. On my laptop screen, the sensor telemetry continued its quiet, continuous work, numbers scrolling in green against black. The river's chemical reality being recorded in real time, signed and timestamped, and cryptographically committed to a record that could not be altered after the fact. 3 weeks of patient construction. 6 biosensors anchored in the dark at the bottom of a poisoned river. A network pathway mapped with surgical precision through corporate infrastructure. A drone log of midnight crimes documented from public airspace. The gala was in 19 days. Sterling Vance was going to stand in front of 200 people and tell them his company stood for a sustainable future. I was going to let the river answer him. I arrived at the Intercontinental 2 hours before the event began. Not as a guest. My name was not on any list and I had not attempted to place it there. I had spent 3 days the previous week studying the hotel's layout through publicly available conference facility documentation, fire egress plans filed with the City Building Authority, and the event production schedule that Vance Chemical's PR firm had distributed to vendor partners. A document that had found its way through a chain of forwarding I had not initiated and did not feel the need to examine too closely into my email inbox. I knew where the service corridors ran. I knew where the AV technical station was positioned relative to the main ballroom entrance. I knew the catering staff entry points and the timing of the pre-event setup rotation. I knew that the period between 6 and 7 p.m., the hour before doors opened to guests, was when the production crew completed their final system checks and then largely vacated the ballroom floor to change and take their pre-show position. I entered through the loading dock at 6:12, carrying a soft equipment case of the kind that AV technicians used, dressed in the dark utility clothing that was invisible in a production environment because it looked like it belonged there. I walked with the unhurried purpose of someone who knew exactly where they were going, which I did. I found the position I had selected from the floor plan. A narrow alcove beside the service corridor entrance at the rear of the ballroom, partially screened by a pillar, and a section of temporary acoustic paneling that the production crew had positioned to manage sound bleed from the pre-event music system. From there I had a clear sightlane to the stage and to the primary LED wall, and I was outside the main camera coverage zones I had identified from the event's published production layout. I set up my equipment and waited. The guests arrived at 7. I watched them from my position at the back, which gave me the particular perspective of someone who was present without being visible, the way a technician or a server is present, occupying the same physical space as the event while existing at a different register of it. I had inhabited that register often enough in my professional life that it required no effort. I watched the room fill with the specific demographic the event had been designed to attract: institutional money, regulatory adjacency, media with financial audiences. The people whose opinion of Vance Chemical Holdings translated directly into stock price, lending terms, and federal enforcement discretion. Sterling worked the room for 40 minutes before taking the stage. I watched him move through it, the handshakes, the specific warmth calibrated differently for each category of guest, the way he held eye contact 2 seconds longer than conversational necessity required, which was a technique I had seen described in a profile of him in a business magazine that I had read 3 times, looking for the places where his understanding of himself did not match how others experienced him. The profile had described him as visionary. The word had bothered me for reasons I could not fully articulate until I was sitting on a riverbank watching white foam collect against my family's fishing dock, and I understood that what the word meant in practice was that he had a talent for making people believe the future he was describing was inevitable rather than chosen. The room was seated by 7:40. The video played first, the one I had watched from this same position in my memory of the cold open, the aerial footage and the saturated greens and the children in the fields. I watched it again now with the knowledge of what was coming, and I noticed things I had not noticed in my preparatory viewings. The specific way the color grade made every water surface look clean and still. The absence of any industrial infrastructure in any shot. The way the music underneath the footage, orchestral, building, the sonic language of arrival, worked to preemptively colonize the emotional response of everyone watching it, to install a feeling before the words came. It was skilled work. I could recognize that without it changing anything. The applause when the video ended was genuine and sustained. Sterling walked to the stage with the ease of a man ascending a space that had been built for him. And in a meaningful sense, it had been the lighting design, the staging, the camera positions, the 50-foot screen behind him carrying his image back to the room at a scale that transformed a person into a presence. $200 million of corporate architecture, in the end, was about producing exactly this moment, a room full of influential people looking up. He began. I had read versions of the speech in the preparatory materials I had gathered. The structure was familiar: historical narrative establishing legacy, pivot to present challenge, positioning of Vance Chemical as a protagonist in the environmental story rather than an antagonist within it, announcement of the EcoShield initiative with its $50 million commitment, the specific framing of industrial operation and environmental responsibility as complementary rather than opposed. It was a speech built to produce a particular understanding in the people hearing it, and it was built well enough that I recognized how it would work on someone who did not know what I knew. He was 8 minutes in when he reached the passage I had been waiting for. Our Crestfield facility, Sterling said, his voice carrying the measured conviction of a man stating established fact, operates at 0 emission levels for all regulated compounds. Our compliance record is, and I say this not as a corporate claim but as a verified, third-party audited reality, exemplary. He paused for a half-beat, the rhythm of a speaker who has learned to let important statements settle before continuing. Vance Chemical does not just meet environmental standards, we set them. I opened my laptop. The terminal window was already running. The execution script was loaded. The pathway confirmed active in a silent handshake I had run 40 minutes earlier from my position in the alcove. The telemetry feed from the Aldermass sensors was live, scrolling in green, cadmium at 391% above federal threshold at that exact moment, arsenic at 417, the discharge cycle in one of its active windows, the river receiving what it had been receiving at midnight for 22 months, recorded and signed and timestamped, and now, for the first time, about to be visible to someone other than me. I typed the 2 words, /Project the Poison, SH. The execution log ran in under 4 seconds. The LED wall behind Sterling Vance, the 50-foot screen that had been carrying his image back to the room, the screen that had shown the pristine forests and the clean water and the children in the fields, went to static. Not a crash. A handoff, clean, deliberate, the way a frequency changes when a stronger signal takes the channel. The static resolved into the split screen in approximately 2 seconds. Left panel, the telemetry cascade. Chemical compound names in white text against black numerical readings beside each one climbing in real time. The federal threshold markers displayed as fixed horizontal lines that the actual readings exceeded by multiples that required no scientific training to understand. At the bottom of the panel in clean sans serif, Live Data, ALD-RMASD River Discharge Manifold, VANCE Chemical Holdings, CRESDFILD Facility. The timestamp updated every second. Right panel, the thermal drone footage. Shot 6 hours and 14 minutes ago. During the discharge window I had documented that morning from public airspace over the river corridor. The infrared image showed the riverbank in false color, the discharge manifold visible as a structural feature, and the effluent plume emerging from it as a spreading thermal signature moving into the river current, unmistakable in the thermal register, the kind of image that did not require a legend to interpret. In the lower right corner of the right panel, GPS coordinates, date, time, the drone's registration number which was licensed in public record. Sterling stopped speaking. The room did not immediately understand what it was seeing. There was a half-second of processing, the collective cognitive lag of 200 people revising their expectation of what a corporate event looked like against what was currently on the screen behind the speaker. I had anticipated this window, and I used it to watch Sterling specifically, because I wanted to see the moment of comprehension rather than the moment of response. It happened at approximately the 2-second mark. He turned to look at the screen. His body stayed in its presentation posture for 1 beat longer than his face did. The face understood first, the body catching up a fraction of a second behind. The sharp intake of breath his microphone captured was not performed. It was the sound of a man whose architecture of control had just experienced a structural failure faster than his composure could compensate for. He tapped his iPad. Nothing changed. He tapped it again, harder, the gesture of a person whose relationship with technology had always been one of command, discovering that command was no longer available to him in this specific direction. The room was coming alive around him. Not loudly, not yet. The response was moving through the guest categories at different speeds. The journalists were the fastest. I watched 3 of them raise phones simultaneously, filming the screen, and I knew from the live stream credentials they were wearing that at least 2 of them were connected to financial media outlets with real-time broadcast capability. What they were filming was going out. The institutional investors were a half-beat behind the journalists, but their response was in some ways more consequential. Several of them were already on their phones, not filming but typing, and I understood what they were doing because I had modeled it in my preparation. The messages going to trading desks, to fund managers, to the compliance officers whose job it was to flag material undisclosed information about publicly traded company. The Federal Trade representatives in the front row had the most controlled response, which was itself a kind of response. The specific stillness of people who were calculating whether what they were witnessing constituted something they were professionally required to act on, and arriving at the answer. Sterling turned back to the room. He still had his microphone. He appeared to have forgotten this. This is a technical. He stopped. He looked at the screen again. The telemetry numbers were still climbing. The thermal plume was still spreading across the right panel in its false color bloom, the timestamp counting forward in real time, the GPS coordinates unchanged, the drone registration number sitting in the corner like a quiet citation. He looked back at the room. There is a specific quality to a silence that occurs when 200 people are in the same space, and all of them understand something that they cannot quite bring themselves to say aloud yet. It is not peaceful. It has a pressure to it, like a room where the atmospheric density has shifted without warning. I have been in very few silences like that in my life, and the one that settled over the Intercontinental Ballroom in the 30 seconds after the split screen appeared was the most complete I have ever experienced. Then someone's phone rang. Not a ringtone, an alert, the kind that financial applications pushed when a monitored asset moved past a threshold parameter. Then another, then 3 at once, from different corners of the room. I looked at Sterling. He had his own phone in his hand now. I watched his face as he looked at it. The stock ticker application that I had seen in the cold open memory. The vertical red line that a 40% decline in under 4 minutes produced on a price chart. The specific graphical shape of a market that had just received information it had not previously had and was revising its understanding accordingly, at the speed that algorithmic trading systems revised understanding, which was faster than human comprehension and indifferent to context. From outside the hotel, faint, then clarifying, then unmistakable, the first siren. I closed my laptop. The connection to the media controller remained active. The script would maintain the override until the venue's technical team managed a hard reset of the media server, which my modeling suggested would take between 12 and 20 minutes given the access protocols involved. By that point, it would not matter. The footage was already streaming. The data was already public. The cryptographic signatures on the telemetry were already committed to a distributed ledger that no corporate legal team could alter after the fact. I picked up my equipment case. Around me, the room was fully in motion now. People standing, people on phones. A cluster near the stage where 2 of Sterling's associates had materialized and were doing something urgent and ineffective with his iPad. A woman near the press row was speaking into a lapel microphone in the focused, clipped cadence of someone delivering live commentary. 2 of the federal representatives had moved together and were conferring in low voices with the particular body language of officials deciding on a course of action. Sterling was still standing at the podium. I don't know what he was looking at. The screen, maybe, or the room, or his phone and its vertical red line. Possibly all 3 moving between them the way a person's attention moves when every available surface is showing them the same information in a different form. I walked to the service corridor door and pushed through it without looking back. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaning fluid and the lingering warmth of commercial kitchen equipment. The sound of the ballroom dropped away behind the door. Ahead of me, the loading dock exit, the night air, the ordinary street outside. In the distance, getting closer, at least 3 separate sirens converging from different directions. I pushed the exterior door open and stepped outside. The air was cold. The street was normal traffic, a couple walking past with a dog, someone unlocking a bicycle. The city doing what cities do, indifferent to what was happening 40 feet away inside a hotel ballroom. I stood there for a moment breathing. Then I walked to my car, put the equipment case in the trunk, and drove toward the highway that led back toward Crestfield, toward the river. The drive back to Crestfield took 90 minutes. I had the radio off. The highway unspooled ahead of me in the dark, the city thinning behind me into suburbs and then into the flat agricultural corridor that preceded the valley where I had grown up. I drove at a steady speed, hands easy on the wheel, and I thought about very little. There is a particular quality of mental stillness that follows the completion of something that has occupied all your available attention for an extended period. Not emptiness, not peace exactly, but a kind of decompression. The cognitive equivalent of a room returning to its resting temperature after the heat source has been removed. My phone was in the cup holder. I had the notifications silenced. By the time I crossed the county line, I could see from the screen's intermittent glow that it had received more messages in 90 minutes than it typically received in a week. I did not look at them. I knew the broad shape of what was happening without needing the details yet, and the details would keep. I drove to the river. The financial press got there first, which was predictable. The journalists with live broadcast credentials who had been in the ballroom had been transmitting within 90 seconds of the override. The footage of Sterling at the podium, the split screen behind him, the telemetry cascade and the thermal plume, his face in the moment of comprehension. It was, from a purely technical standpoint, exceptional footage. High production value environment, dramatic visual contrast between the corporate staging and the data appearing on the screen behind the speaker, a live microphone capturing the intake of breath. If someone had tried to script it, it would have looked like this. The clip reached financial Twitter within 4 minutes of leaving the ballroom. I know the timeline because I reconstructed it afterward from time-stamped posts and broadcast logs. At the 4-minute mark, the clip had been shared by 2 financial journalists with combined followings of approximately 800,000. At the 9-minute mark, it had been picked up by 3 wire services. At the 14-minute mark, a major financial news network had interrupted its scheduled programming to run it with live commentary. The trading algorithms did not wait for human analysis. Algorithmic systems monitoring news feeds and social media for material information about publicly traded companies flagged the clip and its associated text within the first 60 seconds of broad circulation. The initial automated sell orders hit the market at the 3-minute mark. By the time human traders were actively engaged with the situation, reading, processing, deciding, the algorithm-driven movement had already established a directional signal that human decision-making was poorly positioned to contradict. Vance Chemical Holdings stock opened the post-event trading window down 18%. Within 22 minutes, it was down 31%. The 40% threshold was crossed at the 37-minute mark, triggering an automatic trading halt that paused transactions, while the exchange's oversight systems assessed whether the movement constituted a disorderly market condition. During the halt, institutional investors who had been in the ballroom, and several who had not but whose compliance officers had reached them by phone, filed material information disclosure. 2 investment funds announced immediate position review. A third announced suspension of new purchases, pending regulatory clarification. When trading resumed, the stock did not recover. The cryptographic signatures on the telemetry data were verified by an independent forensic firm within 6 hours of the footage going public, a firm that 2 of the institutional investors had retained on an emergency basis, because their fiduciary obligations required them to determine as quickly as possible whether what they had seen was authentic. The verification came back unambiguous. The data was genuine, the chain of custody was intact, the readings had not been altered between generation and transmission. The firm's report used the word immutable 4 times. The Federal Environmental Enforcement Team arrived at the Intercontinental at 10:47 p.m. I know this from the time-stamped news footage, which I watched the following morning on my laptop at the kitchen table in Crestfield with my father sitting across from me, both of us holding coffee that we were not really drinking. The footage showed 3 vehicles pulling into the hotel's main entrance, federal agency identification visible on the agents who stepped out. The event had not fully cleared. The guests who remained were either journalists, federal representatives who had already been present, or people whose lawyers had advised them not to leave. Sterling was still in the building. His own legal team had arrived within the hour following the override, and from the pattern of events that followed, it appeared they had advised him to remain and cooperate pending clarification of his exposure. The clarification, when it came, was not favorable. The lead agent presented Sterling with a federal warrant in the lobby of the Intercontinental, which the camera caught at an angle that showed his face clearly. I have watched that footage more times than I can account for, and what I keep returning to is not the expression on his face, which was controlled, the performance of a man who had been in difficult legal situations before and knew how to present himself through them, but the specific quality of the space around him. The hotel lobby at 11 p.m., mostly empty, the event dismantled, the guests gone, the expensive flowers still in their arrangements beside the check-in desk, the ambient music still playing at low volume because no one had thought to turn it off. He had spent millions of dollars constructing a room in which he was the most powerful person present. The room was still there. He was no longer that person. Simultaneously, the timing was coordinated, I learned later, between the Federal Environmental Unit and the Regional Enforcement Office that had received the automated case file my smart contract had forwarded. A second team arrived at the Crestfield facility. The facility's night shift was operational when they arrived. The discharge manifolds my sensors were anchored to were in an active window. The on-site evidence matched the telemetry record precisely, which it would, because the telemetry record was not a representation of what the facility was doing. It was a direct measurement, continuously logged, cryptographically committed, the river's own testimony rendered in numbers. The facility was secured. Operations were suspended. The environmental containment protocols that should have been in place for 22 months were initiated that night under federal supervision. Sterling was formally charged the following morning: environmental fraud, illegal discharge of regulated compounds, corporate perjury in connection with federal compliance filings, and obstruction in connection with the community waiver campaign. The liability documents, when reviewed in the context of the evidence now available, constituted an attempt to suppress information material to an ongoing violation. His bail was set at a level that accounted for flight risk. He posted it, but the passport was surrendered. The news cycle ran hard for 10 days. The story had most of the elements that news cycles required to sustain themselves: corporate villain, environmental damage, a dramatic public unmasking with footage, financial consequences visible in real time on a stock chart that any viewer could read. The thermal drone footage ran on loop on 3 networks. The telemetry data was reproduced in graphics that translated the chemical readings into comparative formats. This concentration versus what is considered safe, this discharge volume versus what is permitted, that required no scientific background to understand. The community members who had signed the liability waivers retained attorneys, collectively, within the first week. The waiver campaign itself became a separate line of legal exposure for Vance Chemical's executive team, independent of the environmental charges. The EcoShield initiative was quietly removed from the company's website on the 3rd day. The $50 million commitment to sustainable practices was not mentioned again. The remediation agreement was reached 4 months later. The facility's seized assets, combined with a civil settlement that the company's surviving board reached under pressure from its institutional shareholders, funded a comprehensive environmental remediation program for the Aldermast River corridor. Sediment removal, contamination source elimination, a 10-year water quality monitoring program administered by an independent environmental trust, and a community health fund for the residents of Crestfield and the 3 adjacent communities who had been living with the consequences for 22 months. My father did not say much when I told him the terms. He asked about the timeline for the river. I told him that full ecosystem recovery at the contamination levels we had documented typically required 3 to 5 years of active remediation and passive recovery, that the fish population would not return to pre-contamination levels immediately, that the heron nests might not come back for several seasons. He nodded. "But it stops," he said. "It stops," I said. He looked out the window for a moment. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been, the same table, the same view of the backyard, the same quality of afternoon light coming through the window over the sink that I had been looking at my whole life without particularly noticing it. "Chester Harmon's boy," he said. "I know," I said. There was nothing else to say about that. Some things the remediation agreement could not reach, and we both understood it. And we sat with it for a moment the way you sit with things that are true and insufficient simultaneously. Then my father stood up, set his coffee cup in the sink, and said he was going to walk down to the river. He asked if I wanted to come. We walked the eastern bank in the late afternoon, the same stretch I had walked with him 14 months ago when I first came home and saw what the water had become. The remediation work had not yet begun. The legal agreements were finalized, but the physical work was weeks away from starting. The river looked, in most respects, as it had when I had returned. The surface foam still collecting against the banks in places, the water still carrying that quality of chemical dullness. But the discharge had stopped. 3 days after the facility was secured, the sensors anchored inside the manifolds had recorded the discharge cycle failing to initiate for the first time since I had deployed them. The telemetry had continued logging clean readings, background contamination levels from the existing sediment load, nothing new entering the water. I had watched the numbers change on my terminal, and I had not felt what I expected to feel, which I think is common with things you have worked toward for a long time. The feeling, when it came, was quieter than anticipation and more durable. My father walked ahead of me along the bank, hands in his jacket pockets looking at the water. He had not asked me directly about what I had done. He was not a person who required that kind of accounting from people he trusted, and I understood that his silence on the subject was a form of something, not approval exactly, because he was not the kind of man who offered approval as a currency, but something more structural than that. An acknowledgement that the situation had required what it had required, and that he understood, without needing the specifics, that I had approached it with the same care I brought to everything. I watched him stop at the section of bank where his father had fished, where he had taken me as a child, where the water bent slightly around a gravel bar that had been there as long as anyone could remember. He stood there looking at the river for a long time. The light was going, that specific quality of late afternoon in early spring when the sun drops below the tree line, and the sky holds its brightness for a few minutes longer than seems possible before releasing it. The water caught what was left of it in broken fragments, moving. Sterling Vance had spent the better part of 2 years and an amount of money I could not precisely calculate. The PR firm, the legal team, the community relations campaign, the EcoShield initiative, the gala, the 50-foot screen, trying to make the world see a version of reality that did not exist. He had understood correctly that perception was a system that could be engineered. That the right images, the right language, the right room full of the right people, could constitute a kind of truth that was operationally indistinguishable from the actual thing. He had spent millions trying to dye his reputation green. The only color that stuck to him was the orange they issued him when they processed him into the federal detention facility where he was awaiting trial, which I saw in a photograph a journalist published, and which I looked at once and did not need to look at again. What he had not understood, or had understood and believed he could manage, was that reality was not a perception problem. It was a measurement problem. And measurements, if you built the instruments correctly and placed them in the right locations and structured the data so that it could not be altered after the fact, did not respond to PR campaigns or legal pressure or a 50-foot screen in an expensive hotel ballroom. The river had been poisoned. The river had recorded its own poisoning, second by second, in data that could not be retracted. Everything else had followed from that. My father turned from the water and looked at me. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. There was a specific understanding between us that had always operated below the level of language, and this moment was inside it. We walked back along the bank as the light finished going, the water moving beside us, cold and still contaminated, and beginning, underneath the surface where the sensors continued their quiet work, its long process of becoming clean again. It would take years, but the thing that had been poisoning it was gone. That was enough to start with.